To help solve these problems, Director Colby instituted a new intelligence management system known as the Key Intelligence Questions, KIQs. Through formation of a limited number of KIQs, Colby tried to focus production efforts on critical policymaker needs and to provide a basis for reallocating resources towards priority issues. Footnote 53. Pausing the reading footnote 53. In FY 1975, there were 69 KIQs drafted by the Director of National Intelligence's National Intelligence Officers in consultation with the National Security Council Intelligence Committee Working Group. Approximately one-third of the KIQs dealt with Soviet foreign policy motivations and military technology. The other KIQs dealt with such issues as the negotiating position of the Arabs and Israelis, the terrorist threat, etc. Resuming the reading. This section will briefly highlight the resistance which Colby's new management scheme provoked and the difficulties experienced in evaluating the overall community efforts. The Key Intelligence Questions scheme had 4 stages. First, the Director of Central Intelligence issued the KIQs. Then the National Intelligence Officers, NIOs, with representatives from the various collection and production agencies, developed a strategy to answer the individual key intelligence questions. After surveying what information was currently available to answer the KIQs, the various agencies made commitments to collect and produce intelligence reports, quote, against, end quote, the various KIQs. At the end of the year, the DCI evaluated the intelligence community's performance. The KIQ management process has finished its first full year of operation, and a beginning has been made to provide intelligence consumers with the opportunity to make known their priorities for intelligence collection and production. Collection managers have been brought together in developing a strategy to answer key questions, and analysts have received guidance as to the kinds of reports they should produce. In addition, the DCI now has before him considerable information about how the intelligence community is focusing on intelligence questions which are more important to senior national policymakers. He should be in a better position to show collection and production managers where they might have failed to meet their commitments, to work against individual KIQs, or to spend a high percentage of their resources on KIQ-related activities. However, while the key intelligence question concept is imaginative, the management tool has encountered serious problems. First, the KIQ system does not solve the Director of Central Intelligence's problem of trying to establish priorities in intelligence collection and production. Few topics are not included under one KIQ or another. The KIQs have not yet been meshed with the existing requirements system. While the KIQs are supposed to establish collection and production requirements in lieu of the DCI's directive on priorities, both continue to exist today. The Defense Department has not only continued to issue the DIOP, but has produced its own Defense Key Intelligence Questions, DKIQs, which number over 1,000. Instead of providing a means for the DCI to establish priorities for the intelligence community, the KIQs to date have added another layer of requirements. End of page 97, beginning of page 98. Second, Colby's management scheme has met strong resistance from the collection and production agencies. After 1 year, it is difficult to identify many intelligence activities that have changed because of the KIQs. The KIQ strategy reports were issued 9 months after the KIQs and tended to list collection and production activities already underway. The DCI was not in a position to direct the various members of the intelligence community to undertake commitments for different collection efforts, and the strategy reports rarely contained new commitments. While all our agencies participated, DIA and DDO have responded to the KIQs only insofar as they were consistent with their respective internal collection objectives. DIA's, quote, KIQ collection performance report, end quote, pointed out that quote, the defense attache system primarily responds to the DKIQs and JSOP, Joint Strategic Objectives Plan, objectives, and therefore responses to KIQs will have to maintain consistency with the two aforementioned collection guidance vehicles, end quote. Footnote 54. Pausing the reading footnote 54. DIA, quote, KIQ collection performance report, end quote, August 1875. Resuming the reading. In fact, DIA writes its, quote, intelligence collection requests, end quote, continuing intelligence requirements, end quote, and they are then keyed back to the relevant KIQs somewhat as an afterthought. Footnote 55. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 55. In FY 1975, only 7% of DIA's attache reports responded to KIQs. Out of 2,111 attache reports against the KIQs, only 34 of the 69 were covered. According to DIA, military attaches have access to particular types of information, and it would be unfair to assume that they had the capacity to respond to all the KIQs. Resuming the reading, the Deputy Director of Operations for the CIA issues his, quote, objectives, end quote, for the collection of clandestine human intelligence. While these are derived from the KIQs, these, quote, objectives, end quote, are in fact their collection requirements of the clandestine service. Since it takes so long to recruit agents, the Department of Defense considers it is not in a position to respond to specific key intelligence questions dealing with near-term intelligence gaps unless a source is already in place. Moreover, the Department of Defense determined not to DDO, not Department of Defense, determined not to deflect or divert its effort to satisfy KIQs unless the questions happen to fall within DDO internal objectives. DIA and DDO invoked the KIQs to justify their operations and budgets. However, they did not appear to be shaping the programs to meet KIQ objectives. Without authority to direct resources to answer the specific key intelligence questions, the Director of Central Intelligence had little success in compelling the major collectors and producers of intelligence to respond to the KIQs if they were unwilling. Only the National Security Agency, or NSA, has made a serious effort to ensure that their collection requirements are responsive to the KIQs. In United States Intelligence Board meetings, NSA Director General Allen argued that the KIQs should be viewed as requirements for the intelligence community, and the KIQ strategy reports should provide more detailed instructions to field elements for collection. Footnote 56. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 56. Minutes of USIB meeting, February 6, 75. Approximately 70% of NSA's requirements for FY 1975 were KIQ related, and about 50% of its operation and maintenance budget could be ascribed to the KIQs. Resuming the reading. Colby's new management scheme also failed to establish a workable evaluation process. National intelligence officers provided subjective judgments as to how well the community had answered each KIQ, and an assessment of the relative contribution of each agency. Although NIOs discussed their assessments with consumers, they had no staff to conduct a systematic and end of page 98, beginning page 99. Independent review of how well the community had answered the questions. Furthermore, NIOs did not base their evaluations on any specific kinds of information, such as all production reports or all raw intelligence collected on a particular KIQ. They commented on how well the agency had carried out their commitments in strategy reports without asking the collectors for any information about what activities they undertook or what amount of money had been spent. They merely took the collector's word that something had or had not been done. Finally, they did not develop a method to ensure that the judgments of the individual NIOs were consistent with each other. In addition, the IC staff aggregated the amount of resources expended by the various collection and production managers in answering each KIQ and determined what problems had been encountered. However, collection and production managers prepared cost estimates of the activities expended against individual KIQs according to an imprecisely defined process. And although the IC staff provided guidance as to how to do the calculations, the decision as to how best to estimate costs were left to the individual agencies. Not surprisingly, the agencies employed different methods. Footnote 57. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 57. For example, DIA begins with the assumption that 60% of the defense attaché budget goes for collection. This figure is then multiplied by the percentage of attaché reports which responded to KIQs, and the total cost expended against the KIQs was estimated to be $1.3 million. In contrast, DDO calculates According to the IC staff's recommended formula, which estimates the number of man hours devoted against the KIQs and multiplies the estimate by an average production man hour cost. Resuming the reading. Consequently, the cost estimates were not comparable across agencies, and the IC staff had no way of making them comparable since they could not change the different accounting systems in the various intelligence agencies. Footnote 58. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 58. In addition, while the State Department provides cost estimates of INR's intelligence production costs, it did not submit collection cost statistics, maintaining that foreign service reports were not intelligence collection. So the evaluation process did not provide a complete picture of intelligence collection on individual KIQs. Resuming the reading. In summary, the evaluation process did not permit a comparison of total efforts and results against the KIQs on a community-wide basis. Colby lacked the necessary tools to use the KIQ management system to affect resource allocation decisions. The DCI at best was in a position to shame recalcitrance and to action by pointing up stark failures in a particular agency's efforts against the KIQs. The KIQ process was only a surrogate for Director of Central Intelligence Authority to allocate the intelligence resources of the community. Colby's frustrations in trying to direct intelligence community efforts via the KIQ process are indicative of the DCI's limited authority. Within the present intelligence structure, an effort to get the DDO and DIA to respond to what the DCI has defined as key policymaker intelligence questions met considerable resistance. Thus, the most important issue raised by the KIQ management experience is not how to define the process, but whether the DCI can really succeed in directing collection and production activities in the intelligence community toward critical policymaker needs without greater authority over the allocation of resources. End of page 99, beginning page 100. 5. President Ford's Executive Order. On February 18, 1976, President Ford announced a reorganization of the intelligence community to, quote, establish policies to improve the quality of intelligence needed for national security, to clarify the authority and responsibilities of the intelligence departments and agencies, end quote. The major change introduced by the President is the information of the Committee on Foreign Intelligence, CFI, shared by the Director of Central Intelligence and reporting directly to the National Security Council. The Committee on Foreign Intelligence will have responsibility to 1. Quote, control budget preparation and resource allocation for the National Foreign Intelligence Program, end quote. 2. Quote, establish policy priorities for the collection and production of national intelligence, end quote. 3. Quote, establish policy for the management of national foreign intelligence program, end quote. And 4, quote, provide guidance on the relationship between tactical and national intelligence, end quote. Footnote 59. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 59. Executive Order number 11905. Other members of the CFI will be the Deputy Secretary of Defense for Intelligence and the Deputy Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs. Resuming the reading. It is still too soon to pass judgment as to whether the executive order will aid the DCI in its efforts to coordinate the activities of the intelligence community. By making the Director of Central Intelligence chairman of the Committee on Foreign Intelligence, the executive order appears to enhance his stature of the DCI by expanding his role in the allocation of national intelligence resources. But as in the case of the Nixon Directive in 1971, the DCI appears to have been given an expanded set of responsibilities without a real reduction in the authority of other members of the intelligence community over their own operations. There exist many ambiguities in the language of the executive order, particularly with regard to the role of the CFI. The CFI is given responsibility to, quote, control budget preparation and resource allocation, end quote, for national intelligence programs. But the Secretary of Defense retains responsibility to, quote, direct, fund, and operate NSA, end quote. The CFI is asked to, quote, review and amend, end quote, the budget prior to submission to OMB, or Office of Management and Budget. As if the CFI will not control the preparation of the budget, but rather would become involved only after the agencies and departments independently put together their own budget. Finally, the relationship is not clear between the DCI's responsibility to, quote, ensure the development and submission of a budget, end quote, and the CFI's responsibility to, quote, control budget preparation, end quote. Moreover, the specific prohibition against DCI and CFI responsibility for tactical intelligence appears to be a step backward from the 1971 Nixon Directive, which asked the DCI to plan and review the allocation of all intelligence resources, while DCIs since 1971 have not become deeply involved in such tactical intelligence questions. They have reserved the right to become involved, and on several occasions they have supported efforts to transfer money from the National Defense Department intelligence budget to the budgets of the military services, or vice versa. There are, in addition, at least theoretically, trade-offs to be made between tactical and national intelligence, especially since the dividing mark between all intelligence operations has become increasingly blurred with the development of large and expensive technical collection systems. End of page 100, beginning page 101. C. The Director of the CIA. At the same time, the Director of Central Intelligence has responsibility for coordinating the activities of the entire community. He also has direct authority over the intelligence operations of the CIA. As director, the DCI runs covert operations and manages the collection of clandestine human intelligence. Directorate of Operations manages the collection of signals intelligence abroad and allocates resources for the development and operation of certain technical systems, collection systems. Directorate of Science and Technology, and produces current intelligence and finished intelligence memoranda. Directorate of Intelligence. The fact that the DCIs have also directed the operations of the CIA has had a variety of consequences. First, DCI have tended to focus most of their attention on CIA operations. The first directors were preoccupied with organizing and establishing CIA and with defining the agency's role in relation to the other agency organizations. While Alan Dulles and Richard Helms were DCI, each spent considerable time running covert operations. John McCone focused on improving the CIA's intelligence product and developing new technical collection systems when he was director. Admiral Rawborn emphasized refining the agency's budgetary procedures. Footnote 60. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 60. Colby, December 11th, 75, pages 4 through 5. Resuming the reading. Second, by having their own capabilities to collect and produce intelligence, DCIs have been able to assert their influence over intelligence activities of the other members of the intelligence community. John Clark, former Associate Deputy to the DCI for Intelligence Community, testified that Helms objected to the suggestion that CIA get rid of all its SIGINT activities because he needed, quote, something to keep, his foot in the door, end quote, so he could, quote, look at the bigger problem, end quote. Footnote 61. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 61. Clark, February 5th, 76, page 59. Resuming the reading. According to Clark, to some degree historically, the director's involvement has not only been based upon good, healthy competition among systems, which I think is good, but the directors have seen it as an opportunity to give them a voice at the table in judgments which have importance to their higher role, a larger role as director of CI. Footnote 62. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 62. IBID, pages 59 through 60. Resuming the reading. However, this ability to assert influence in turn has had another consequence. DCIs have been accused of not being able to play an objective role as community leader while they have responsibility for directing one of the community's intelligence agencies. Potential conflict exists in decisions with respect to every CIA activity. For example, on each of the two occasions that the DCI went directly to the President to object to a Defense Department budget recommendation, the Director of Central Intelligence won presidential support for a CIA-developed technical collection system. Such DCI advocacy raises the fundamental question of whether the DCI can indeed be an objective community leader if he is also director of the CIA, which undertakes research and development on technical collection systems. According to James Schlesinger, there has always been concern, and frequently there has been the reality that the DCI does not overlook all these. End of page 101, beginning page 102. Assets in a balanced way. As long as the Director of Central Intelligence has special responsibility for the management of clandestine activities, that it tends to affect and to some extent contaminate his ability to be a spokesman of the community as a whole involving intelligence operations, which are regarded as reasonably innocent from the purview of American life. Components of the intelligence community other than the CIA have feared that the DCI would be tempted to expand the authority of the CIA in the collection activities relative to the other components of the intelligence community, and there has been some evidence that supports such suspicion. What I believe is, at the present time, you have got inconsistent expectations of the DCI. He is supposed to be the fair judge amongst the elements of the intelligence community, at the same time that CIA personnel expect him to be a special advocate for the CIA. You cannot have both roles. Footnote 63. Pausing the reading footnote 63. February 2nd, 76, pages 8 and 49. Resuming the reading. President Ford's executive order seeks in part to reduce the conflict of interest problem by establishing 2 deputies to the DCI, one for intelligence community affairs and one for CIA operations. The Director of Central Intelligence and his deputy for community affairs will have offices in downtown Washington. Nevertheless, the DCI will continue to have an office at the CIA headquarters and to have legal responsibility for the operations of the agency, and at the same time, general responsibility for coordinating the activities of the entire intelligence community. End of page 102. Beginning page 103. Beginning page 103. 6. History of the Central Intelligence Agency. Introduction. Footnote 1. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 1. This section is the summary version of a longer history to be published as an appendix to the committee's final report. This section and the longer history are based on 4 principal groups of sources. Since classification and restrictions prevent citing individual sources directly, the categories of sources are identified as follows. One, approximately 75 volumes from the series of internal CIA histories and, a rich, if uneven collection of studies which deal with individual components of the CIA. The administrations of the directors of Central Intelligence and specialized areas of intelligence analysis. The histories have been compiled since the late 1940s and constitute a unique institutional memory. 2. Approximately 60 interviews with present and retired agency employees. These interviews were invaluable in providing depth of insight and understanding to the organization. 3. special studies and reports conducted both within and outside the agency. They comprise reviews of functional areas and of the overall administration of the CIA. 4. Documents and statistics supplied to the Select Committee by the CIA in response to specific requests. They include internal communications, budgetary allocations, and information on grade levels and personal strengths. Resuming the reading. The current political climate and the mystique of secrecy surrounding the intelligence profession have created misperceptions about the Central Intelligence Agency. The CIA has come to be viewed as an unfeathered monolith, defining and determining its activities independent of other elements of government and of the direction of American foreign policy. This is a distortion. During its 29-year history, the agency has been shaped by the course of international events, by pressures from other government agencies, and by its own internal norms. An exhaustive history of the CIA would demand an equally exhaustive history of American foreign policy. The role of Congress and the executive and other components of the intelligence community, and an examination of the interaction among all these forces. Given the constraints of time and the need to pursue other areas of research, this was an impossible task for the committee. Nonetheless, recognizing the multiple influences that have contributed to the agency's development, the committee has attempted to broadly outline the CIA's organizational evolution. An historical study of this nature serves two important purposes. First, it provides a means of understanding the agency's present structure. Second, and more importantly, by analyzing the causal elements in the CIA's pattern of activity, this study should illuminate possibilities for and the obstacles to future reform in the U.S. foreign intelligence system. The concept of a peacetime Central Intelligence Organization had its origins in World War II with the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, through the driving initiative and single-minded determination of General William J. Donovan, sponsor and later first director of OSS. The organization became the United States' first central intelligence body. Although OSS was disbanded in 1945 and its functional, end of page 103, beginning page 104. Functional components reassigned to other government agencies, the existence of OSS was important to the CIA. First, OSS provided an organizational precedent for the CIA. Like OSS, the CIA included clandestine collection and operations and intelligence analysis. Second, many OSS personnel later joined the CIA. In 1947, the year of the CIA's establishment, approximately one-third of the CIA's personnel were OSS veterans. Third, OSS suffered many of the same problems later experienced by the CIA. Both encountered resistance to the execution of their mission from other government agencies. Both experienced the difficulty of having their intelligence analysis, quote, heard, end quote, and both were characterized by the dominance of their clandestine operational components. Despite the similarities in the two organizations, OSS was an instrument of war, and Donovan and his organization were regarded by many as the group of adventurers, more concerned with daring do operations than with intelligence analysis. The post-war organization emerged from different circumstances from those that had fostered the development of OSS. Following the war, American policy makers conceived the idea of a peacetime Central Intelligence Organization with a specific purpose in mind: to provide senior government officials with high-quality, objective intelligence analysis. At the time of the new agency's creation, the military services and the State Department had their own independent intelligence capabilities. However, the value of their analysis was limited, since their respective policy objectives often skewed their judgments. By reviewing and synthesizing the data collected by the State Department and the military services, a centralized body was intended to produce national intelligence estimates independent of policy biases. Quote, national and quote, intelligence meant integrated interdepartmental intelligence that exceeded the perspective and competence of individual departments. And that covered the broad aspects of national policy. Quote, estimates, end quote, meant predictive judgments on the policies and motives of foreign governments, rather than descriptive summaries of daily events or, quote, current intelligence, end quote. Although policymakers agreed on the necessity for national intelligence estimates, they did not anticipate or consider the constraints that would impede achievement of their objective. As a result, the CIA assumed functions very different from its principal mission, becoming a competing producer of current intelligence and a covert operational instrument in the American Cold War offensive. The establishment of the Central Intelligence Agency coincided with the emergence of the Soviet Union as the antagonist of the United States. This was the single most important external factor in shaping the agency's development. Of equal importance were the internal organizational arrangements that determined the patterns of influence within the agency. In exploring the agency's complex development, this summary will address the following questions. What institutional and jurisdictional obstacles prevented the agency from fulfilling its original mission? To what extent have these obstacles persisted? In what ways have U.S. foreign policy objectives influenced priorities in the agency's activities? What internal arrangements have determined the agency's emphases in intelligence production and in clandestine? End of page 104, beginning page 105. Activities. What accounts for the continued dominance of the clandestine component within the agency? How have individual directors of the Central Intelligence defined their roles, and what impact have their definitions had on the direction of the agency? What impact did technological developments have on the agency and on the agency's relationship with the departmental intelligence services? This study is not intended to catalog the CIA's covert operations, but to present an analytical framework within which the CIA's policies and practices may be understood. The following section summarizes the agency's evolution by dividing its history into 4 segments: 1946 to 1952, 1953 to 1961, 1962 to 1970, and 1971 to 1975. Each period constitutes a distinct phase in the agency's development. A. The Central Intelligence Group and the Central Intelligence Agency, 1946 to 1952. The years 1946 to 1952 were perhaps the most crucial in determining the functions of the Central Intelligence Organization. The period marked a dramatic transformation in the mission, size, and structure of the new entity. In 1946, the Central Intelligence Group, CIG, the CIA's predecessor, was conceived and established as an intelligence coordinating body to minimize the duplicative efforts of the departments and to provide objective intelligence analysis to senior policymakers. By 1952, the Central Intelligence Agency was engaged in independent intelligence production and covert operations. The CIG was an extension of executive departments. Its personnel and budget were allocated from state, army, and navy. By 1952, the CIA had developed into an independent government agency commanding manpower and budget far exceeding anything originally imagined. 1. The origins of the Central Intelligence Group. As World War II ended, new patterns of decision-making emerged within the United States government. In the transition from war to peace, policymakers were redefining their organizational and informational needs. As president, Franklin Roosevelt maintained a highly personalized style of decision-making, relying primarily on informal conversations with senior officials. Truman preferred to confer with his cabinet officers as a collective body. This meant that officials in the state, war, and navy departments were more consistent participants in presidential decisions than they had been under Roosevelt. From October through December 1945, U.S. government agencies engaged in a series of policy debates about the necessity for the nature of the future United States intelligence capability. Three major factors dominated the discussions. First was the issue of post-war reorganization of the executive branch. The debate focused around the question of an independent Air Force and the unification of the services under a Department of Defense. Discussion of a separate intelligence agency and its structure, authority, and accountability was closely linked to the larger problem of defense reorganization. Second, it was clear from the outset that no department was willing to consider reassigning its existing intelligence function and accompanying. End of page 105, beginning page 106. Accompanying personnel and budgetary allotments to a central agency. As departmental representatives aired their preferences, maintenance of independent capabilities was an accepted element in defining future organization. Coordination, not centralization, was the maximum that each department was willing to concede. Third, the functions under discussion were intelligence analysis and the dissemination of intelligence. The shadow of the Pearl Harbor disaster dominated policymakers thinking about the purpose of a central intelligence agency. They saw themselves rectifying the conditions that allowed Pearl Harbor to happen, a fragmented military-based intelligence apparatus which, in current terminology, could not distinguish, quote, signals, end quote, from, quote, noise, end quote, let alone make its assessments available to senior officials. Formal discussion on the subject of the Central Intelligence Function began in the fall of 1945. The departments presented their separate views, while two independent studies also examined the issue. Inherent in all of the recommendations was the assumption that departments would control the intelligence product. None advocated giving the Central Intelligence Group sole responsibility for collection and analysis. All favored making the Central Intelligence Body responsible to the departments themselves rather than to the President. Each department lobbied for an arrangement that would give itself an advantage in intelligence coordination. The presidential directive establishing the Central Intelligence Group reflected these preferences. The departments retained autonomy over their intelligence services, and the CIG's budget and staff were to be drawn from the separate agencies. Instead, issued on January 22, 1946, the directive provided the CIG with a director chosen by the President. The CIG was responsible for the coordination, planning, evaluation, and dissemination of intelligence. The National Intelligence Authority, NIA, a group comprised of the Secretary of State, their representative of the President, served as the group's supervisory body. A group comprised of the Secretary of State, the Secretary of War, the Secretary of the Navy, and a personal representative of the President served as the group's supervisory body. The Intelligence Advisory Board, IAB, which included the heads of the military and civilian intelligence agencies, was an advisory group to the Director of Central Intelligence, DCI. Through budget, personnel, and oversight, the departments had assured control over the Central Intelligence Group. The CIG was a creature of departments that were determined to maintain independent capabilities as well as their direct advisory relationship to the President. In January 1946, they succeeded in doing both. By retaining autonomy over their intelligence operations, they established the strong institutional claims that would persist for the lifetime of the Central Intelligence Agency. 2. The Directors of Central Intelligence, 1946 to 1952. At a time when the new agency was developing its mission, the role of its senior official was crucial. The Director of Central Intelligence was responsible for representing the agency's interests to the departments and for pressing its jurisdictional claims. In large part, the strength of the agency relative to the departments was dependent on the stature that the DCI commanded as an individual. The 4 DCIs, end of page 106, beginning page 107. From 1946 to 1952 ranged from providing only weak leadership to firmly solidifying the new organization in the Washington bureaucracy. 3 of the 4 men were career military officers. Their appointments were indicative of the degree of control the military services managed to retain over the agency and the acceptance of the service's primary role in the intelligence process. Sidney Soares, the first DCI, served from January to June 1946 through a rear admiral though a rear admiral, he was not a military careerist, but a business executive who had spent his wartime service in naval intelligence. He accepted the job with the understanding that he would remain only long enough to establish an organization. Having participated in the drafting of the directive which created CIG, Soares had a fixed concept of the Central Intelligence Function, one that did not challenge the position of the departmental intelligence components. Under Lieutenant General Hoyt Vandenberg, CIG moved beyond the production of coordinated intelligence to acquire a clandestine collection capability, as well as authority to conduct independent research and analysis. Vandenberg was an aggressive, ambitious personality, and as the nephew of Arthur Vandenberg, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, exerted considerable influence on behalf of the CIG. In May 1947, Vandenberg was succeeded by Rear Admiral Roscoe Hillenkoetter. 2 months after Hillenkoetter's appointment, the CIG was reconstituted as the Central Intelligence Agency. Hillenkoetter did not command the personal stature to successfully assert the agency's position relative to the departments, nor did he possess the administrative ability to manage the agency's rapidly expanding functions. It was precisely because of Hillenkoetter's weakness that General Walter Bedell Smith was selected to succeed him in October 1950. Nicknamed, quote, the American Bulldog, end quote, by Winston Churchill, Smith was a tough-minded, hard-driving, often intimidating career military officer who effected major organizational changes during his tenure. Smith's temperament and his senior military status made him one of the strongest DCIs in the agent's history. He left the agency in February 1953. 3. The evolution of the Central Intelligence Function. 1946 to 1952. The CIG had been established to rectify the duplication among the military intelligence services and to compensate for their biases. The rather vaguely conceived notion was that a small staff in the CIG would assemble and review the raw data collected by the departmental intelligence services and produce objective national estimates for the use of senior American policymakers. Although, in theory, the concept was reasonable and derived from informational needs, institutional resistance make implement virtually impossible. Departmental services was jealously guarded by, both their information and what they believed were their prerogatives in providing policy guidance to the President, making the CIG's primary mission an exercise in futility. Limited in the execution of its responsibility for coordinated estimates, the CIG emerged within a year as a current intelligence producer, generating its own summaries of daily events, and thereby competing with the departments in the dissemination of information. End of page 107, beginning page 108. An important factor in the change was the CIG's authorization to carry out independent research and analysis, quote, not being presently performed, end quote, by other departments. Under this authorization, granted in the spring of 1946, the Office of Reports and Estimates, ORE, was established. The Office of Reports and Estimates function were manifold: the production of national current intelligence, scientific, technical, and economic intelligence, as well as intra-agency coordination for national estimates. With its own research and analysis capability, the Central Intelligence Group could carry out an independent intelligence function without having to rely on the departments for data. The change made the CIG an intelligence producer while still assuming the continuation of its role as a coordinator for estimates. Yet acquisition of a research and analysis role meant that independent production would outstrip coordinated intelligence as a primary mission. Fundamentally, it would be far easier to assimilate and analyze data than it had been or would be to engage the departments in producing, quote, coordinated, end quote, analysis. The same 1946 directive, which provided the CIG with an independent research and analysis capability, also granted the CIG a clandestine collection capability. Since the end of the war, the remnant of OSS's clandestine collection capability rested with the Strategic Services Unit, SSU, then in the War Department. In the post-war dismantling of OSS, SSU was never intended to be more than a temporary body, and in the spring of 1946, SSU's duties, responsibilities, and personnel were transferred to CIG along with SSU's 7 overseas field stations and communications and logistical apparatus. The transfer result in the establishment of the Office of Special Operations, OSO. The Office of Special Operations was responsible for espionage and counter-espionage. From the beginning, the data collected by OSO was highly compartmented. ORE did not draw on OSO for its raw information. Instead, overt collection was ORE's major source of data. Since its creation, the Central Intelligence Group had 2 overt collection components. The Domestic Contact Service, DCS, solicited domestic sources, including travelers and businessmen, for foreign intelligence information on a voluntary basis. The Foreign Broadcast Information Service, FBIS, is an element of OSS, monitored overseas broadcasts. These components, together with foreign publications, provided ORE with most of its basic information. The acquisition of a clandestine collection capability and authorization to carry out independent research and analysis enlarged CIG's personnel strength considerably. As of June 1946, the total CIG staff numbered approximately 1,816. Proportionately, approximately 1/3 were overseas with OSO. Of those stationed in Washington, approximately half were devoted to administrative and support functions. 1/3 were assigned to the Office of Special Operations, and the remainder to intelligence production. The passage of the National Security Act in July 1947 legislated the changes in the executive branch that had been under discussion since 1945. The Act established an independent Air Force provided for coordination by a Committee of Service Chiefs, Joint Chiefs of Staff, JCS, and a Secretary of Defense, and created the National, end of page 108, beginning page 109, Security Council, NSC. The CIG became an independent department and was renamed the Central Intelligence Agency. Under the Act, the CIA's mission was only loosely defined, since efforts to thrash out the CIA's duties in specific terms would have contributed to the tension surrounding the unification of the services. The four general tasks assigned to the agency were: 1. To advise the National Security Council on matters related to national security; 2. To make recommendations to the NSC regarding the coordination of intelligence activities of the departments; 3. To coordinate and evaluate intelligence and provide for its appropriate dissemination; and 4. Quote, to perform such other functions as the NSC will from time to time direct, end quote. The Act did not alter the functions of the CIG. Clandestine collection, over-collection, production of national current intelligence, and intra-agency coordination for national estimates continued, and the personnel and internal structure remained the same. The Act affirmed the CIA's role in coordinating the intelligence activities of the State Department and the military, determining which activities would most appropriately and most efficiently be conducted by which departments to avoid duplication. In 1947, the Intelligence Advisory Committee, IAC, was created to serve as a coordinating body in establishing intelligence requirements. Footnote 2. Among the departments. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 2. Requirements constitute the informational objectives of intelligence collection, e.g., in 1947, determining Soviet troop strengths in Eastern Europe. Resuming the reading. Chaired by the Director of Central Intelligence, the committee included representatives from the Department of State, Army, Air Force, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the Atomic Energy Commission. Although the DCI was to establish priorities for intelligence collection and analysis, he did not have the budgetary or administrative authority to control the departmental components. Moreover, no department was willing to compromise what it perceived as its own intelligence needs to meet the collective needs of policymakers, as defined by the DCI. As the CIA evolved between 1947 and 1950, it never fulfilled its estimates function, but continued to expand its independent intelligence production. In July 1949, an internal study conducted by a senior ORE staff member states that ORE's emphasis in production had shifted, quote, from the broad long-term type of problem to a narrowly defined short-term, and from the predictive to the non-predictive type, end quote. In 1949, ORE had 11 regular publications. Only one of these addressed the national intelligence questions and was published with the concurrence or dissent of the other departments. Less than 1/10 of the ORE's products were serving the purpose for which the CIG and the CIA had been created. 4. The reorganization of the intelligence function, 1950. By the time Walter Bedell Smith became DCI in 1950, it was clear that the CIA's record on the production of national intelligence estimates had fallen short of expectation. ORE had become a directionless service organization, attempting to answer requirements levied by all agencies to all manner of subjects: politics, economics, science, and technology. The wholesale growth had only confused ORE's mission and led the organization into attempting analysis in areas already adequately covered by other departments. Likewise, the end of page 109, beginning page 110. Obstacles posed by the departments prevented the DCI and the agency from carrying out coordination of the activities of the departmental intelligence components. And I will stop here for today's recording.